Before we begin, remember this. What you are about to hear is not theory, but a forbidden lesson from the depths of the human psyche. Jung warned that silence is the most dangerous weapon against the narcissist, a blade that cuts without sound. As you listen, guard your mind carefully, for this knowledge will change the way you see every word, every pause, every silence in your life. Stay with me until the end. Subscribe so you do not walk this path alone, and share in the comments the moment when silence became your own. Every 20 seconds, somewhere in the world, a victim of psychological abuse answers a message they never wanted to read, offers a word they did not believe, or apologizes for a wound they never caused. The cycle turns endless because the predator, the narcissist, survives on response. Any response, whether love, anger, or despair. What they cannot endure is silence. Silence is not emptiness. It is not surrender. In the language of archetypes, silence is a blade sharper than speech, a mirror the narcissist cannot shatter. It is the forbidden weapon Jung hinted at in his studies, the quiet refusal that exposes the abyss behind the mask. Imagine a stage crowded with actors, lights blinding, voices rising in chaos. One figure commands the play, the narcissist, not by brilliance, by manipulation of attention. Every gaze, every word feeds them. And then suddenly the lights go out. The audience withdraws. The stage grows cold. The narcissist is left alone, speaking into this is silence, and it terrifies them more than confrontation ever could. Jung recognized that evil does not always thrive in noise. Often it thrives in the endless exchange of energy, the compulsive compulsion to respond, explain, justify. When patients sat before him, describing the torment of being entangled with narcissistic figures, partners, parents, leaders, he noticed the same truth. What chained them was not the cruelty itself, but the endless reaction it provoked. He strikes, and you cry. He accuses, and you defend. He wounds, and you explain. And thus you are bound, Jung wrote in his notes. But when the patient grew still, when they no longer mirrored the performance, the narcissist's grip faltered. Silence broke the spell. The danger of silence is that it feels unnatural. Victims of manipulation feel compelled to respond. Neuroscience shows why. The human brain, wired for social survival, releases stress hormones when communication is cut off. The anterior cingulate cortex interprets silence as social exclusion, a primal threat. This is why silence is painful for the victim, but it is also why it is deadly for the narcissist. Their survival depends on control of perception, on maintaining the illusion that they are central, commanding. Silence does not merely deny them attention, it erases them from the stage. Ancient traditions captured this paradox. In Taoist philosophy, the sage defeats chaos not by striking, but by withdrawing, becoming empty, beyond manipulation. In Christian monastic practice, silence was weapon and sanctuary, a shield against the voices of temptation. In Greek myth, Orpheus loses Eurydice, not in noise, but in a glance, a silent act that unravels destiny. Silence has always been more than absent. It is presence without surrender, a refusal carved in shadow. The story of one of Jung's patients illustrates the terror silence awakens. A young woman, entangled with a domineering lover, found herself drained of identity. He accused, explained. He insulted. She defended. He demanded. She gave. Jung guided her to experiment with silence. When her lover launched into accusations, she responded with nothing, not even anger. She described the room that night as unbearable. His voice grew louder, his eyes wilder, his fists tightening around empty air. But she held her silence. And then she saw it, fear in his eye. For the first time, the predator felt small. This case was not about victory, but revelation. The woman felt the shaking in her bones, the terror of resisting her instinct to respond. But she also felt power, strange and cold, as if she had stepped outside his script and left him stranded. Jung recorded her words. I realized that my silence was louder than his rage. Here lies the forbidden lesson. Silence is not passive. It is active refusal. It is the destruction of the narcissist stage. It says without words, I will not play. Jung warned that such silence must be conscious, not avoidance, not numbness. It must be chosen, deliberate, carried like a blade. Otherwise, it becomes repression, a silence that feeds shadow within. But when wielded consciously, it is the one language the narcissist cannot corrupt. The danger, of course, is that silence awakens escalation. Narcissists fear abandonment more than hatred. Faced with silence, they may rage, threaten, weep. This is the test. To hold silence is to endure the storm without breaking, to remain still as the archetype claws at the walls. The patient who survived her lover's rage said afterward, "He was screaming, but I heard something deeper. I heard him cracking." Silence, then, is not only a weapon, but a mirror. It reflects the narcissist's emptiness back upon them, forcing them to confront the void they spend their lives hiding. Jung called it the return of the shadow upon its source. Modern psychology calls it gray rocking, the refusal to fuel manipulation. But behind the terms lies the same truth. Silence starves the predator. And so the question lingers like an echo in the dark. How many words have you wasted, feeding the hunger of those who never intended to hear you? How many explanations have been chains disguised as answers? And what would happen if you let the silence fall, not as retreat, but as weapon? Hate they understand, rage they anticipate. Even tears and pleading are part of their script. The narcissist thrives on emotional turbulence because any response confirms their power. But silence is different. Silence dismantles their theater. It is not absence, it is defiance in its purest form, an invisible wall that denies entry. Jung observed that predators of the psyche are never as disturbed by hostility as they are by emptiness. Hatred is still a dialogue. Silence is exile. Picture the narcissist as a performer, on his voice, his gestures grand, demanding the audience's gaze. Anger from the crowd still feeds. Even boos confirm that he matters. But imagine the curtain drops mid-performance. The hall, his words echo in the dark, unanswered. This is the silence Jung described in his archetypal analysis, the sudden vacuum where the narcissist's false self suffocates. Why is silence so lethal? Because it mirrors what they fear most, their own inner void. The narcissist constructs a false self, a mask polished from admiration, fear, and control. It must be fed constantly by others' attention. Without that fuel, the mask cracks, revealing the hollow core not bared of. Neuroscience supports this with chilling clarity. Studies at the University of Michigan show that narcissistic personalities exhibit heightened amygdala reactivity when ignored. The brain registers silence not as indifference, but as annihilation. To them, being unseen feels like death. Jung anticipated this long before fMRI machines lit up neural pathways. He wrote that narcissistic structures of the psyche feed on reflection. They need to see themselves mirrored in others' eyes, whether in admiration or in fear. Remove the mirror, their identity trembles. Silence does exactly. It withdraws the reflection, forcing them to face an abyss. And the abyss, Jung warned, is the one enemy they cannot defeat. Ancient traditions whisper the same secret. In Christian scripture, the devil is not overthrown by words, but silenced by refusal. In Zen practice, the master's silence often shatters illusions more brutally than any sermon. In Greek myth, Medusa's power lay in being seen, until Perseus used a mirror not to gaze but to withhold. Across cultures, the same pattern emerges. Silence is the weapon that reveals emptiness. Jung documented a case where a patient, tormented by a narcissistic father, finally chose silence. For years, the father accused, mocked, demanded. The son responded with rage, then with reason, then with despair. Each reaction tightened the father's grip. Jung advised him to stop speaking altogether. When the father launched into his tirade, the son stood still, silent, offering no defense. At first, the father grew louder, his voice cracking. Then, unexpectedly, he stopped. Days passed, and he fell ill, listless. Jung noted, the son's silence became the mirror in which the father's emptiness appeared. The patient described the moment in chilling terms. It was like watching a man drown in air. He gasped for my anger, my defense, but I gave him nothing. And in that nothing, he collapsed. Silence had stripped away the stage. The predator was left to face his own shadow without fuel. But silence is not with. Narcissists often escalate when deprived of supply. They may lash out, manipulate more viciously, or retreat to find new prey. This is why Jung emphasized that silence must be conscious and prepared. It cannot be avoidance born of fear. It must be deliberate, an act of power rather than weakness. In his words, to be silent with awareness is to wield a sword that cuts without sound. Modern psychology echoes this in strategies like the no-contact rule or the gray rock method. Victims are taught to starve narcissists of reaction, to deprive them of drama. Therapists warn that the first stage is always the hardest. The narcissist will rage, cry, or threaten. But if silence holds, the illusion collapses. Studies on abusive relationships show that consistent disengagement is one of the few methods that reduces narcissistic control. Collectively, this fear of silence extends to societies. Authoritarian leaders, like narcissists, dread being ignored. They thrive on attention, even outrage, because it confirms their significance. But when the crowd falls quiet, when citizens withdraw their energy, the facade trembles. Silence, in collective form, is revolution without a word. Jung saw mass possession thrives on noise, chance, silence breaks them. And so the secret emerges, forbidden yet undeniable. The narcissist does not fear your hate. They fear your nothing. They fear the mirror withdrawn. They fear the silence that exposes the hollow chamber inside them. But this secret carries a cost. To wield silence is to walk a razor's edge. It demands endurance, discipline, and clarity. It is not passivity, but active defiance, a refusal to be consumed. And for the empath, whose instinct is to respond, to comfort, to explain, silence feels like betrayal of the self. Yet it is precisely in that betrayal of compulsion that freedom is born. The silence that terrifies the narcissist is the silence that liberates the victim, and once it is chosen, the balance shifts forever. The year was 1927, Zurich, heavy with fog, the air carrying the metallic scent of rain-soaked iron from the train station. A woman entered Jung's office, her coat buttoned too tightly, her gloved hands trembling, as if the fabric itself were holding her together. She was young, no more than 30, but her eyes betrayed decades of exhaustion. She spoke softly, so softly that Jung leaned forward to catch her words. He devoured. Her husband was not violent in the way neighbors could. There were no bruises to trace, no broken glass, no police at the door. His weapons were words, sharpened into accusations, demands, manipulations. He mocked her in public with charm, praised himself by diminishing her. In private, his voice was a saw blade that never rested. And she, bound by duty and compassion, responded to every word. She argued, defended, explained. She wept, pleaded, promised. The more she spoke, the weaker she felt, as if each syllable was siphoned directly from her veins. Jung listened, the smoke from his pipe curling between them like he asked her to describe her nights. She closed her eyes and said she lay awake in silence, replaying conversations, imagining better defenses, sharper answers. But always by morning, her voice was already claimed. He had trained her into dialogue, a prisoner of endless reaction. Then Jung did what seemed impossible. He told her to stop answering, to take her voice and seal it away, to meet his words with nothing. She looked at him in horror. But silence is defeat. Silence is surrender. Jung shook his head. No, silence is refusal. Silence is the only language he cannot use against you. The first night she tried, she described the terror as unbearable. He accused her of betrayal. He shouted her name again and again, waiting for her to crack. She gripped the edge of her chair, her nails biting into the wood, her body trembling so violently she thought she would shatter. His rage rose, then faltered. Finally, he fell into silence himself, but his silence, it was collapse. She told Jung that the silence in the room became monstrous, a living thing. She heard the tick of the clock like hammers, felt the cold seep into her bones. Yet within that horror was something unexpected, freedom. For the first time, she realized she had not been destroyed. Her silence had not killed her. It had killed his script. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated. At first he escalated, throwing objects, slamming doors, threatening departure, but each outburst weakened him. He needed her words to fuel his performance, and without them he stumbled, like an actor forgetting lines. The silence hollowed him, and though he sought to fill that void with noise, the emptiness grew louder than his rage. Jung noted in his casebook that the woman's dreams began to change. Where once she dreamt of endless corridors filled with voices, she now dreamt of vast halls where her footsteps echoed alone. The silence of her dreams was terrifying but pure. No voices mocked her there. No accusations chased her. Only the sound of her own presence. Jung called this the re-entry of the self into the chamber of silence. Modern science gives her courage new meaning. Research at Harvard Medical School reveals that victims of narcissistic abuse often develop hypervigilance. Their brains wired to respond instantly to threat cues. Silence interrupts this neural compulsion. By refusing to respond, victims rewire their circuits, teaching their nervous systems that survival does not require reaction. What Jung intuited is now mapped in synaptic pathways. Silence is not weakness, but neurological reclamation. Ancient wisdom foreshadowed her discovery. In the desert monasteries of early Christianity, silence was practiced as spiritual warfare. Monks spoke of demons who whispered in their ears, demanding dialogue, tempting them into distraction. Only by remaining silent did the monks starve those phantoms. In the Tao Te Ching, silence is called the route of return, the way back to self when chaos consumes. In Hindu philosophy, mauna, sacred silence, is not absence. The patient's choice echoed across centuries. The weapon of silence is as old as, but his power broke. She described his presence as smaller. He became restless, pacing rooms as though searching for the reflection. She still feared him, but her fear was different now. No longer submission, but vigilance. She told Jung, "I realized I could survive without speaking, and that survival was the beginning of my..." Jung closed his notes with a phrase that reads like a warning to us all. The silence she carried became more terrible to him than her words ever were. In that terror, his shadow began to collapse. The lesson remains chilling. Silence does not change the predator, it changes the prey. And in that change, the predator's mask cracks. The terror that silence evokes in the narcissist is not mystical alone, it is biological. Beneath the archetypal language of shadows and mirrors, there are neurons, hormones flooding, circuits in the brain collapsing under strain. Jung saw silence as a psychic weapon. Modern research confirms it as a neurological earthquake. The narcissist's dread is written not only in myth, but in measurable patterns of the nervous. Imagine a brain wired like a city at night, lights pulsing in every district. For the narcissist, those lights burn brightest in the networks that crave validation and fear, abandonment. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of identity, is fragile, sustained by external reflection. The amygdala, the alarm system of the brain, flares when attention is withdrawn. Studies at the University of Michigan reveal that narcissistic personalities react to social rejection with hyperactive amygdala responses, as if they were facing mortal danger. Silence, therefore, is processed not as indifference, but as annihilation. It is the psychic equivalent of death. Other experiments deepen the horror. Neuroscientists at UCLA found that when narcissists were ignored in controlled interactions, their cortisol levels spiked violently, stress hormones flooding the bloodstream. The silence of the other triggered panic, rage, despair, the physiological echoes of abandonment. For ordinary personalities, being ignored is uncomfortable. For the narcissist, it is catastrophic. Their false self, constructed from external supply, begins to fracture under the weight of nothing. Psychologists call this narcissistic injury, but Jung would call it the cracking of the mask. He wrote that when the mirror is removed, the false image collapses, leaving behind the void the narcissist has fled all their life. Science now shows that this void has a bodily signature: increased heart rate, skin conductivity spikes, restless motor movement. The silence is not abstract. It is experienced as terror crawling through the flesh. For the victim, the science offers an explanation for their own torment. Victims often describe silence as unbearable too. Their nervous system, conditioned to respond, floods with adrenaline, the thought of withholding. Their whole body trembles with the urge to explain, defend, appease. Research at Stanford shows that survivors of long-term emotional abuse develop hypersensitivity in their social cognition network, feeling compelled to repair every rupture. This is why holding silence feels like walking through fire. but it is also why it is healing. Every second of endured silence rewires the neural pathway, teaching the brain that survival does not require response. Ancient wisdom saw this before science could measure it. In Buddhist meditation, silence was not simply the absence of words, but the practice of watching the mind storms without reason. The early Christian monks wrote of hesychia, a silence so deep that demons screamed in its presence. What they described as demons are what neuroscientists today map as intrusive thought patterns, conditioned reaction. Across centuries, the wisdom is the same. Silence rewires the... Consider the patient Jung guided into silence against her father's tirade. Modern psychology would describe her act as breaking a trauma bond, severing the neurological circuit that chained her. Her trembling body, her sweat-drenched nights, were the signs of neurons fighting against years of conditioning. Each time she endured, each time she chose not to answer, her brain laid down new pathways. Jung saw her transformation as archetypal. Today, science would call it neuroplasticity. The language differs, the truth remains. Silence heals by breaking the loop. But healing for the victim is destruction for the narcissist. The same silence that rewires one nervous system destabilizes the other. For them, the loop must never break. Their identity is tethered to control. Their mask is sustained by response. Neuroscience confirms what Jung already knew. To deny the narcissist reaction is to starve their false self. It is why their rage escalates, why their pleas grow frantic. They are fighting not for attention alone, but for existence. The science is chilling in its clarity. Silence is not passive. It is an active disruption of neural patterns, a strike at the biological core of manipulation. Jung's archetype of the predator feeding on reflection finds its modern echo in the amygdala, firing under rejection, in cortisol, drowning the body when ignored. Silence exposes the hollow at the center of the narcissist, and science now illuminates why that hollow cannot bear light. So the question presses heavier. If silence is death to the narcissist's false self, why do we still fear it more than they do? Why does the victim tremble to withhold words, when words are the very chains that bind them? The answer lies in conditioning, in neural scars carved over years of... But the science and Jung's wisdom agree. What terrifies both predator and prey is also the path. Long before the word narcissism was spoken in psychology, silence had already been feared, revered, and weaponized in myths, spiritual traditions. Across cultures, the absence of words was never neutral. It was sacred, dangerous, divine, and deadly. Jung often said the unconscious speaks in symbols, and silence was one of its most enduring archetypes, a symbol of both creation and destruction, of power that cannot be controlled. For the narcissist, silence embodies the ultimate terror, because in every tradition, silence belongs not to the manipulator, but to the divine. In the desert of early Christianity, monks fled society not to escape noise, but to confront. They believed demons whispered loudest when words fell away, tempting them to break their stillness. Their refusal to answer was not weakness, it was war. The Desert Fathers wrote of silence as a weapon sharper than exorcism, because it starved the tempter of response. What these ascetics knew, Jung later confirmed in his patients, the predator thrives on dialogue, on exchange, on mirrored energy. When the mirror is withdrawn, the demon of manipulation chokes on its own emptiness. Buddhism carries the same truth in subtler tones. Mara, the archetype, attacked the Buddha under the Bodhi tree with storms, armies, and Yet Mara's power crumbled not because of debate or resistance, but because the Buddha sat unmoved, silent, touching the earth as witness. In that gesture of quiet refusal, the illusions dissolved. Silence here is not absent, but defiance, the same defiance Jung urged his patients to embody when facing narcissistic tyrants in their lives. Greek mythology also cloaked silence in danger. Consider Orpheus descending into the underworld to retrieve Eurydice. His one command was silence, to walk without speaking, without look. But the compulsion to break silence destroyed him. In Jungian terms, Orpheus represents the empath ensnared by the need to respond to glance, to speak. His tragedy, the same as that of victims of narcissism. Silence could have saved him, but his voice betrayed. In Hindu philosophy, Mauna, or sacred silence, is described as the highest form of speech. Sages believed that silence communicated truths too deep for words, truths that no manipulator could distort. When practiced as discipline, silence became a shield. When broken compulsively, it became weakness. The narcissist, who survives by bending language into chains, has no defense against a truth that exists beyond words. Even Norse mythology whispers this power. Odin, the All-Father, sacrificed not with noise but with silence, hanging 9 nights in stillness, refusing to cry out until the runes of wisdom revealed themselves. Here, silence is endurance, initiation, the crucible, where shadow and light converge. Jung often referred to myths like this as psychic maps, showing how silence both terrifies and transforms. These echoes across civilizations converge on one truth. Silence belongs to those who can endure it. The manipulator cannot. The narcissist, like Mara, like the demons of the desert, like Orpheus failing to restrain his glance, is undone by silence because it denies them the one thing they cannot fabricate: authentic presence. Words can be twisted, emotions hijacked, appearances staged. Silence cannot. It stands like a stone, immovable, beyond corruption. Jung believed myths were not stories of gods alone, reflections of human psyche. To him, the narcissist is simply a modern mask of the same ancient predator archetype, and silence remains the oldest weapon against it. Whether in the caves of monks, the meditation of sages, or the trials of mythic heroes, silence exposes illusion and forces confrontation with the void. That void is what the narcissist flees from all their life, and what silence delivers without mercy. For the victim, to enter silence is to walk the path of saints and mythic figures, to endure what feels unbearable, yet transforms. It is to sit in stillness while every nerve screams to respond. It is to withhold when the archetype demands reaction. In that endurance lies liberation. In that silence lies power. So ask yourself, what tradition runs through your blood? Are you Orpheus, glancing back, breaking silence to your own destruction? Are you the monk holding silence as shield against whispers? Are you the Buddha unmoved beneath the storm? Jung would say the choice is not symbolic alone. It is daily, visceral, and deadly serious. For silence is not empty. It is the oldest language of resistance, and the one the narcissist cannot speak. It does not happen with explosion. It begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, like hairline cracks spreading across a porcelain. The narcissist senses it before they can name it. The shift in air, their prey no longer answers expected. The silence is subtle at first, but its power unfolds in stages, and each stage leaves behind signs like fingerprints of a coming collapse. Jung warned that these signs are not ordinary. They are archetypal, revealing the slow death of the predator's performance. The first sign is agitation. Words that once commanded attention now fall into the void. The narcissist repeats themselves, growing louder, trying to summon the old reactions. Their voice sharpens, their gestures exaggerate, as if noise itself could force the mirror to return. But the silence remains, and in that silence, they glimpse something unbearable: irrelevance. Victims describe the moment as watching a storm form behind someone's eyes, restless, desperate, more frightening than open rage. It is the first taste of silence's poison. The second sign is escalation. The narcissist, starved of response, turns to manipulation. They cry, they beg, they threaten, they play the victim. One patient, Jung observed, recalled her husband suddenly collapsing in tears when she refused to answer his accusation. "You are destroying me," he wailed, though hours earlier he had accused her of betrayal. This reversal is not sincerity, it is strategy. The narcissist flails like a drowning man, grasping at any reaction, for silence is drowning them faster than hatred ever could. The third sign is projection. They accuse you of the silence they cannot bear. They say you are cold, cruel, unfeeling, while in truth they describe themselves. Jung wrote that projection is the favorite tool of the shadow, for it hides one's emptiness by painting it on it. Victims often falter here, breaking silence to defend themselves, but to respond is to hand back the stage. Silence must hold, for a projection collapses only when it echoes unanswered. Then comes the fourth sign, the most dangerous: rage. Silence is the mirror that forces the narcissist to face their own void, and rage erupts as an attempt to shatter that mirror. They may scream, slam doors, even lash out physically. This is why Jung emphasized that silence must be strategic, never reckless. It must be paired with boundaries, withdrawal, protection, for rage is not proof that silence has failed. It is proof that silence has struck the deepest wound. Yet beyond rage lies the fifth sign, exhaustion. The narcissist, deprived of fuel, begins to shrink. Their words lose force. Their eyes lose focus. They may retreat into sulking isolation, their mask slipping into cracks of fatigue. Victims describe seeing them smaller, less imposing, almost pitiful. Jung noted in his writings, the tyrant collapses not when he is defeated in battle, but when the people cease to answer his voice. Silence is that collective refusal enacted in the private theater of relationship. These signs are not victories in themselves. They are warnings that the silence is working. Modern psychology confirms this progression. Therapists who counsel survivors of narcissistic abuse describe the same cycle: agitation, escalation, projection, rage, and collapse. Neurological studies show stress hormones spike in narcissists during rejection, then plummet into depressive withdrawal when the silence holds. The body itself betrays what Jung already knew. Silence dismantles their illusion. Ancient traditions spoke of these stages as trials. The Desert Fathers wrote that demons first shout, then whisper, then accuse, then rage, before finally vanishing when the monk remained silent. In Buddhist texts, Mara sent armies, daughters, and storms before retreating into silence of his own. Myth after myth teaches the same rhythm. The predator thrashes most violently before defeat. The empath who wields silence must see these signs not as failures, but as milestones, proof that the shadow is unraveling. But the greatest danger is not their rage, it is your doubt. When the accusations pour, when the tears fall, when the room shakes with slammed doors, the victim's instinct is to break, to answer, to explain. The narcissist knows it is their last weapon. To endure here is to walk through fire. Jung compared it to initiation rites of ancient tribes. The initiate faced terror, humiliation, torment, and the only path to transformation was endurance. Silence is the initiation, and these signs are its trials. So, watch carefully. The agitation in their voice, the sudden weeping, the accusations that echo their own emptiness, the storm of rage, the pitiful collapse. These are not random. They are stages of possession breaking. Each one is a scene in the slow dismantling of the archetype. To recognize them is to remain unshaken. To endure them is to survive. And in surviving, the silence grows louder than any scream, more powerful than any argument. It is the sound of chains snapping, of illusions dissolving, of the predator staring into the abyss of their own shadow. It begins like a crack in glass, at first almost invisible, then spreading in jagged lines until the whole surface threatens to shatter. Silence is the pressure behind that. The narcissist's mask, once flawless and gleaming, starts to tremble under the weight of nothing. What follows is not random chaos, but a predictable sequence, stages of collapse that Jung would have recognized as archetypal death throes, the breaking down of a false self devoured by its own emptiness. Stage 1, the restless search. The first reaction to silence is restless. The narcissist circles like a predator whose prey has vanished. They send messages, repeat accusations, test smaller hooks. Victims describe this stage as a barrage of attempts, questions disguised as concern, manipulative statements like, "I just want closure," or sudden love bombing after days of cruelty. It is the mask scrambling for reflection. The silence denies it, and the crack deepens. Stage 2. The storm restlessness becomes rage. The mask fractures, exposing the raw void beneath. The narcissist unleashes words like knives, desperate to provoke any reaction. They accuse, they insult, they threaten abandonment or revenge. In Jung's terms, this is the archetype possessed by its own shadow, devouring itself when its external fuel is withdrawn. Neuroscience shows cortisol levels peak in this stage, stress hormones flooding the body. The predator is not in control here. It is drowning in its own storm. Stage 3. The descent into victimhood. When rage fails, the collapse turns inward. The narcissist suddenly casts themselves as the wounded one. Tears, apologies, confessions appear, dripping with desperation. They say things like, "I can't live without you," or "You're destroying me by ignoring me." This is not transformation but strategy, another mask thrown forward in panic. Jung observed in patients entangled with narcissists that this stage often trapped them again. Empathy was reactivated, silence was broken. But if silence holds, the performance unravels into hollowness. Stage 4. Withdrawal and sulking. The mask begins to shrink. Rage and victimhood exhausted, the narcissist retreats. They sulk, they disappear, they attempt to punish through absence. This is the stage where victims often feel the deepest temptation to break silence, fearing they are cruel or that reconciliation. Yet, Jung wrote, it is here that the demon weakens, no longer projecting outward, but collapsing inward. In psychological terms, this is narcissistic collapse, the moment the false self falters, leaving behind fragments of emptiness. Stage 5. Fragmentation. The final stage is collapse itself. The mask breaks entirely, though only temporarily. The narcissist may fall into despair, depression, even catatonia. Their false self, denied fuel, reveals the fragile, terrified child beneath, the original wound they have spent their life. Jung saw this not as redemption, but as exposure. The predator revealed not as invincible, but as broken. For the victim, this stage can feel unsettling, even pitiful, but it is the clearest proof of silence's power. Collectively, these stages mirror the fall of tyrant. At first, propaganda multiplies, desperate to hold attention. Then rage erupts in violence against dissenters. Next comes the play of victimhood, appeals to loyalty, to history, to suffering. When that fails, regimes retreat into isolation, sulking in paranoia. Finally, they fragment, collapsing under their own illusions. History echoes psychology. The silence of the people dismantles the masks of kings, just as the silence of the victim dismantles the mask. Ancient traditions describe this collapse too. In the Desert Fathers' writings, demons first roared, then wept, then whispered, then vanished into nothing when unanswered. In Hindu myths, asuras swelled with fury when ignored, then shrank into shadows. In Norse sagas, false gods who demanded worship lost their power when mortals fell silent. The archetype collapses always in stages, for it cannot survive without reflection. But Jung issued a chilling warning. Collapse is not the end. The narcissist often rebuilds the mask, finding new prey, new mirrors, new scripts. Silence dismantles, but it does not annihilate. The predator archetype said is like smoke, dispersed when wind blows, but quick to gather when the air stills. Thus, the survivor must remain vigilant. Silence is not a one-time act. It is a discipline, a stance of awareness carried daily. Still, there is power in watching unfold. Victims often describe the moment of clarity and they realize the tyrant before them is smaller than they imagined, fragile under their silence. The mask shatters, and behind it is not a god, not a monster, but a frightened shadow gasping for fuel. That recognition is liberation, for once you have seen the collapse, you can never again believe. And so silence becomes not just survival, but revelation, the unveiling of truth behind illusion, the archetype stripping away. The narcissist collapses, and in that, the victims their own strength reflected back. The power of silence does not belong only to the individual. It spreads like a shadow across groups, families, nations. Jung warned that what we see in one tormented relationship is but a miniature of something vaster, the possession of entire communities by the archetype of the narcissist. When one person withdraws their response, the predator falters, but when many remain silent together, the mask of power trembles on a scale that shakes the world. In the family, the narcissist's reign thrives on noise, arguments, explanations, accusations bouncing between walls until the air itself feels poisoned. Each member plays a role. One defends, another attacks, a third pleads. It is theater written to keep the tyrant at the center. But when family members cease to answer, when words fall away, a strange quiet descends. At first it feels unbearable. The narcissist storms, accusing everyone of conspiracy, crying betrayal. Yet, if the silence holds, their voice begins to echo strangely in the void. Children notice the cracks, spouses glimpse the hollowness. A regime once held together by fear begins to dissolve in the shared refusal to play its script. History echoes this in chilling scale. Authoritarian leaders, archetypal narcissists on thrones, survive not merely on loyalty, but on noise, chants, propaganda, the endless roar of attention. Jung observed in the 1930s how Germany fell into possession by a collective shadow, every voice repeating slogans until individuality was drowned. But even here, silence had power. When a crowd no longer chanted, when workers quietly failed to obey, when citizens refused to answer propaganda, the spell weakened. Leaders fear silence more than rebellion, for rebellion feeds the drama of power, but silence starves it. Modern psychology confirms this dynamic. Studies of cults reveal that withdrawal of collective attention dismantles control faster than open confrontation. In one case, when members of a sect agreed silently to stop answering their leaders' daily messages, his hold collapsed within weeks. He raged, he begged, he cursed, but the void swallowed his words. Without the mirror of their voices, power dissolved. Silence became revolution. Ancient traditions foresaw this truth. In the Bible, when Christ faced accusers, he often remained silent, and his silence unsettled authorities more than any defense. In Zen, the master's silence is a teaching that stops the disciples' questions mid-breath, dismantling illusions at their root. In myth, gods often lose power not when slain, but when mortals cease to worship. The collective silence of prayers withheld dethrones deities as surely swords. But collective silence is not easy. It requires endurance greater than rebellion. For rebellion unites through action, noise, catharsis. Silence unites through restraint, through shared endurance of discomfort. Families that break free describe nights heavy with unspoken tension, when no one answered the tyrant's act. Nations that shook off regimes speak of empty streets, boycott, a stillness that rang louder than shouts. The silence is terrifying because it feels like nothing, yet it is the one force that empties thrones and unravels illusions. Jung described these fields as psychic contagions, where one person's refusal to respond spreads like a spark. In his words, silence is infectious. One will not speak, then another, and soon the whole field is emptied of noise. Victims of narcissistic systems discover that the silence of one can awaken the silence of many until the predator stands alone. The archetype that feeds on endless mirrors is confronted with nothing but the abyss of its own shadow. The danger, however, is relapse. Collectives, like individuals, often break silence too soon. Families erupt again in arguments, societies return to slogans, movements fall back in. The predator then reclaims the stage. This is why Jung insisted that silence must be conscious, sustained, a discipline rather than a moment. It must be held until the field itself shifts, until the mask crumbles beyond repair. The lesson is chilling. Silence is not only personal survival, it is collective liberation. It is the refusal of families to echo abuse, the refusal of societies to feed propaganda, the refusal of crowds to roar when tyrants demand worship. In silence, the predator shrinks. In silence, the field clears. In silence, the shadow is revealed. So the question becomes heavier now. What noise are you still feeding? What arguments, what explanations, what repetitions keep the tyrant alive in your family, your workplace, your nation? And what would happen if together you all simply... Silence is not as simple as closing your lips. It is not the muteness of fear, nor the numbness of resignation. True silence, the silence Jung recognized as weapon, is a discipline, an act of defiance that requires more strength than argument ever could. To wield it against a narcissist without breaking is to carry fire in your chest and forbid yourself from letting it escape as words. It is to bleed without sound, to endure storms without reply, to stand unmoved while the predator claws at the walls of your mind. Jung warned his patients that silence, if unconscious, becomes repression. It drives wounds deeper, making the victim brittle, turning the unspoken into poison. But conscious silence is different. It is sharp, precise, deliberate. It is the choice to withhold fuel, not out of weakness, but out of... The first protocol, then, is awareness. You must know why you are silent, and you must hold that knowledge. Without awareness, silence is a coffin. With awareness, silence is a sword. The second protocol is boundary. Silence cannot survive in the open battlefield alone. If you attempt to stay quiet while remaining fully exposed to attack, the predator will escalate until your silence shatters. Boundaries must be drawn like fortified walls, physical separation, locked doors, blocked messages, clear refusals. Silence thrives when the space is controlled. Victims who tried to practice silence without boundaries often collapsed into rage or tears under relentless assault. Those who paired silence with firm withdrawal found strength they did not know they had. The third protocol is endurance. The narcissist will not accept silence easily. They will rage, they will cry, they will accuse, they will collapse. Each tactic is designed to make you break. Jung compared this to initiation rituals of ancient tribes. The novice placed in a pit of serpents or bound to endure fire without flinching. The trial is not survival of comfort, it's survival of terror. To wield silence, you must endure the storm without answering, knowing that the storm is proof of your weapon's power. The fourth protocol is retreat. Silence does not mean standing endlessly in the presence of the predator. Strategic withdrawal is essential. Jung advised patients to remove themselves physically whenever possible, to leave the room, to refuse the call, to vanish from the field where the narcissist performs. Retreat is not cowardice. It is tactical silence, denying them not only your voice, but your presence. Modern therapy echoes this. No contact rules, gray rock techniques, disengagement strategy. Survival depends on refusing the stage itself. The fifth protocol, silence drains the victim too, because the compulsion to speak is primal. Your body will shake, your chest will tighten, your nerves will scream for... You must prepare rituals of grounding, breath that steadies, spaces of solitude, strength, allies who remind you why you... Jung called this the necessity of inner witnesses, parts of the psyche that stand beside. In practice, it means praying in or confiding in someone who will not betray. The sixth is vigilant. The narcissist will test again and again, even after collapse. They will send subtle messages, pretend remorse, seek to reopen the dialogue. You must remain alert. Jung warned, the shadow returns where it is forgotten. Silence must be remembered, held as daily practice. The predator waits for your lapse. The moment you answer without awareness, the mask rebuilds. Finally, the seventh protocol is integration. Silence is not meant to exile your own voice forever. It is meant to free it from slavery. Once the predator has lost power, once the storm has passed, your voice must return, not in defense or explanation, but in truth. Jung believed that the survivor must integrate the silence into their soul, carrying it as a constant shield. Your words, once enslaved, are now yours to wield. The silence taught you their value. Ancient traditions mirror these protocols. The monks guarded silence with ritual, boundaries of cloister walls. The Buddha's stillness beneath the Bodhi tree was paired with retreat from society. Warriors in myth endured trials of silence as tests of endurance, proving their initiation into wisdom. Each echoes Jung's teaching. Silence without discipline is fragile. Silence with discipline is unbreakable. So let this be remembered. Silence is not. It is survival. It is refusal. It is strategy. And like all weapons, it must be wielded carefully, or it will turn back. The narcissist will seek to twist it into guilt, to make you believe your silence is cruelty. But the truth is darker. Your silence is the mirror that shows them their own abyss, and that is why they fear it more than hate. There is always a moment after the battle, when the voices fade, when the air grows heavy with something unspeakable. It is not peace, it is not victory, it is the echo of the abyss. Silence remains not only as a weapon wielded against the narcissist, but as a mirror turned back upon ourselves. Jung warned that whoever confronts the shadow must accept the final revelation. What terrifies the predator is also what terrifies the prey. Silence exposes not only their emptiness, but ours. For the narcissist, Silence is annihilation. Their false self cannot exist with reflection, without noise, without fuel. In silence, their mask collapses, and they are forced to face the void they fled since childhood. But for the empath, silence is no less dangerous. It strips away the compulsions that defined them, the endless explanations, the reflexive defenses, the illusion that their words could save anyone. When silence falls, they too must face the void within, the fear of abandonment, the hunger for validation, the wounds left by years of possession. Silence is the abyss both sides avoid, and yet it is the only path through. Jung described the shadow as the brother no one wishes to acknowledge, the twin we exile into darkness. The narcissist projects it onto others, demanding mirrors to keep from seeing it. The victim buries it beneath compulsions to respond, to explain, to serve. But silence breaks both strategies. It removes the mirror, it halts the words, it forces both predator and prey to see the unseeable. And in that unbearable confrontation, something ancient stirs. Not destruction. Ancient traditions whisper of this moment as initiation. In Christian mysticism, Christ's silence before his accusers was the silence of transcendence, a refusal that revealed deeper truth. In Zen, the koan ends not with an answer, but with silence, shattering thought and revealing emptiness as wisdom. In Greek tragedy, the greatest revelations fall not in speech, but in the silence after catastrophe, when the chorus stands mute before fate. The abyss is not filled with words, it is endured in silence. The philosophical climax is not victory over the narcissist. It is recognition that silence is not theirs alone to fear. It belongs to us as well. To wield silence consciously is to stand at the edge of the abyss and not turn away. It is to accept that within us too there is hunger, shadow, void. To see it without denial is liberation. To refuse it is to remain enslaved forever, whether by others or by ourselves. This is the lesson Jung left, the one too many forget. Silence is not empty. It is full of shadow. It is heavy with truths unspoken, with illusions shattered, with power reclaimed. It can destroy, but it can also transform. It can collapse masks, but it can also forge identities stronger than the chains of reaction. To endure silence is to walk through death without dying, to hold the abyss in your chest without being consumed. And when you emerge, the world is never the same. You speak less, but your words carry weight. You react less, but your choices cut sharper. You love differently, not as sacrifice chained to manipulation, but as strength rooted in freedom. Silence has carved you, scarred you, remade you. It is not absence anymore, it is presence, unyielding, untouchable. So let this echo remain in your mind long after this voice fades. The narcissist fears silence because it is the abyss that swallows their mask. You fear silence because it is the abyss that shows you your own shadow. But if you can endure it, if you can wield it with consciousness, then silence becomes not a void but a foundation, the ground on which freedom is finally built. Now, ask yourself, whose mask in your life would shatter if you stopped answering, and what shadow of your own would you be forced to see in the silence that followed? If this journey through Jung's forbidden lesson has awakened something in you, do not let it vanish in quiet. Write in the comments the moment when silence first terrified. Subscribe so the map of shadow and survival continues to unfold before you. And remember, silence is not absent. It is power. It is weapon. It is mirror. It is the abyss, waiting